Oh dear. Oh, what are we going to crucify me in the middle, are we?
Yeah. Sorry, we're out of wood.
Hang on, I'll just grab my cup of water.
Can we please reconvene?
You got enough there?
I've got to go in the centre so I can be stoned.
I haven't even got stones.
Oh, yeah, grab a seat.
Oh, thank you.
Laurie, thank you very much for your kind words to our faith.
I hope I haven't upset too many people. My objective is not to upset people, but to get people thinking.
Yeah.
That because so many Christians, they're brought up in nursery, what do you call it, Sunday school,
Yeah.
and they're told all these stories about the Bible, and they just sort of accept them and they don't question them. But being a sceptic, I say, question all things.
Yeah. Well, our motto is turning believers into thinkers and thinkers into believers. Certainly, I feel we're making progress in turning believers into thinkers, but maybe in your case at the moment, we're not so successful in turning thinkers into believers.
Oh yeah, don't waste your time on me.
But when I listened to what you said, I thought, well, you presented a huge amount of information, and around a high percentage of what you said, I agree with. Then there's the other, 20% or 30%, where I thought, hang on, doesn't sound right to me.
Fair enough.
Now, I'm not sure how to handle this, because there's just so many slides, and we could kind of walk through and nitpick it, but I don't think that would be extremely productive. So at this stage, I might sit down and open it up to you to actually come and ask questions or make statements in terms of how you react to what Laurie said.
I'd like to get started.
Yes, you may.
Laurie talked a fair bit about Gnosticism, and he packaged a lot of things under that title that I would be hesitant to do. He also talked a lot about the Nazarenes. Now, the Nazarene sect have been more revealed to us by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before 1947, when we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we knew very little about the Nazarenes, and we've found several books in the Dead Sea Scrolls which describe this group, and I think Laurie's put a bit too much under that title too. The Nazarenes were a pretty small group. They had some pretty way out ideas. They were rejected by their own society, and I think he's given them too much power in his story, because they weren't the true custodians of Christianity. People who've tried to say the Nazarenes were the original Christians have failed pretty badly, in my opinion. I read a few of them, Barbara Theory for one, and others.
I'd burn her books. She's...
Oh, I agree with you totally on that.
yes, she's a bit extreme.
Sorry, I'm probably mixing up here.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
The Nazarenes have just had too much.
I think
put
you're
under
talking
it.
about the Essenes.
I don't think that the Nazarenes held the original Christianity and Paul invented a different one. I find that the Christians left Jerusalem very early after the crucifixion, and that passage you used from Acts was in fact 40 days after the resurrection, not 70 AD.
Yeah, and that was referring to the covenant.
Yeah, no, what I was trying to explain was that according to the gospel, the Acts, Jesus had told them they had to remain in Jerusalem until he came back. So there was a very powerful incentive that they would have still been in Jerusalem.
We disagree with you.
Yeah.
So we have to agree to
Hang on, one at a time.
There are some things where we're going to have to agree to disagree on the facts of the case, not just how it's interpreted.
fair enough.
Probably one. So with the Gnostics, this might be another one. With the Gnostics, you talked a lot about Christianity borrowing from Gnosticism. But 2 weeks ago, we had someone here who was talking about Gnosticism borrowing from Christianity.
I disagreed with a lot of what he had to say, but he was a good speaker.
Yeah. So I guess that's another case where it's not just interpretation, but also the facts that we're disagreeing on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I've got my bias just as you have, but I'm pretty persuaded by that other point of view that Gnosticism borrowed from Christianity.
And between Greek religion and
Christianity. True, but
I disagree with that because the teachings of the Gnostic were probably thousands of years old. As far as we can go back, it appears that there were roots of Gnosticism even in ancient Egypt and Babylonia, because a lot of their ideas were similar.
Yeah. On this business of like the roots of Christianity, I agree with you on the term Christian, like Jesus was not a Christian.
Yeah.
The term Christian was a term invented much later, and people didn't see things in those terms. Regarding the original church in Jerusalem, that church in Jerusalem would have seen themselves as the fulfilment of the Jewish hope.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And they saw themselves very much as Jews. They continued to worship in the temple, and for the gospel to go to the Gentiles was a huge issue for them. But in terms of saying that Paul kind of hijacked Christianity, I think that's an overstatement. Like he's an enormous character in the New Testament. He almost occupies a third of it.
Yeah, well, he is the main character.
Yeah.
Even Jesus takes second place.
But like the Gospel of Mark is totally independent from Paul's writings.
Yeah.
Mark had no knowledge of Paul's writings, and Paul had no knowledge of Mark. So the things that you see in Mark are not due to Paul. And also the idea that Paul invented the term Lord. There's in both Luke and Matthew, Jesus asks a question. The Christ, whose son is he? And then he says, why does the Lord say to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Now the interesting thing is that passage comes from both Matthew and Luke, and they're dead copies. And it's not in Mark. And so scholars say that is derived from a document called Quill, which means source, which is very early. And it's Jewish, and it's not Pauline.
Yeah.
So there's recognition outside of Paul's writings, definitely, that that Jesus is the Christ. Now you referred to Hebrews, assume that Paul wrote Hebrews.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of dispute about that.
Well, it seems pretty obvious to me when I read it that it's not written by Paul. It's an entirely different style. But he says of the Son, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever.
Yeah.
So there is a very strong deistic or theistic attributes applied to Jesus in writings other than Paul's.
Perhaps if I explain a little bit, what I was trying to do is to clearly distinguish the original followers of Jesus, the Nazarenes. They were the Jews, the first people that were attracted to the teachings of Jesus. And I've called them the Nazarenes to distinguish them from the Gentile Christians. And basically, they were Jews, they believed in Judaism, they worshipped in the temple, and they followed the Jewish law. And a lot of the things which Paul started to say would have been completely antagonistic to them. And that's why I believe you have to distinguish them, that they're over here and the Christians are here, and neither the twain do not mix.
I think it was
Broken. Surely that was broken down as Peter was called to Cornelius, well before Paul. Surely that was the time when it was broken over. Wasn't it?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
When Peter was called by vision to go up to Caesarea from Jaffa,
Yeah.
30 miles up the road, talk to Cornelius, surely that was where the breakthrough was.
that's
Forget
where
about
the
Paul.
Gentiles
It's already
Sure.
Yeah, what you have to understand is that the Gospels are not a historical account of what actually happened. What happened was that you had this group, the Nazarenes, and they disappeared off the face of the earth. And all that was left were the Christians. Now, the Christians, hang on, the Christians then wrote the Gospels. So this is why you find, like, the story of Stephen.
Went to Egypt.
Yeah, they didn't disappear. They
The
went out.
Coptics even trace their history back to him, you know. And what about it's changing the subject a little bit? And I think that we'd have to disagree as generally on the historicalness of the documents, okay? Because no history writing is perfect, but as history writing goes, I think Luke was pretty well state of the art for the time, and the others weren't bad. Well, the other synoptics weren't were good. So, there's really no other apart from Josephus. They're the best documents that we have that have a historical, but more on the theological side of it. You know, when you talked about how the suffering servant was a sort of a reinterpretation because Jesus didn't come back in glory 5 minutes later. If you read through Isaiah, the picture of the suffering servant is pretty clear. They saw it as being the whole nation, and the reinterpretation there was that whole nationness was focused on this one individual. But I think it's pretty clear that the idea of a suffering saviour servant was already there, long before Christians were called Christians.
And that suffering servant in the Old Testament in Isaiah was the first time atonement was mentioned as suffering associated with buying back of coming back to God. And my understanding is that the Jews, sort of sounds a bit funny, but the Jews suffered enough for their own atonement and a bit more for the rest of the world. And that's why the people on the islands are jumping and dancing around for joy, and highways are going to be made into Jerusalem, because the whole world, the sin of Israel was that they worshipped false gods. And the whole world worshipped false gods. And by the Jewish suffering, nation suffering, they would then buy back the whole of the world, that God would reveal himself to all of them through his temple. That's what that was about. Now, I'm a bit off track here, but I believe, I believe that it didn't happen. The world didn't become Christian or Jewish, and they didn't worship Yahweh. They kept on with their business. But Jesus saw himself as a suffering servant. What was Israel, as you said, was now Jesus himself, and he set out to do that suffering on the cross and give himself up. And by doing that, he would save the world. That's why they all went off to the Gentiles. And that's where I disagree with Laurie, was that this idea that the Gentiles were out and nothing to do with them. The Gentiles were part of what the Old Testament was about.
It was always supposed to be that they were blessed to be a blessing, not that they were the only special one.
You know, just one other thing which I learned is, you know how Yahweh chose Jews as his own special people in the Old Testament? And apparently there's a document which says that there was a day when all the gods got together and had a council, and they decided to divide the world up amongst themselves, and each god chose his own people, and that he would be their God and they would be his people. And Yahweh is a part of that. Of course, it's not in the Old
closest you'd get to that in the Old Testament would be in Job, I guess.
Is that right?
Yeah. Did you read Job?
Anyway, is there a question in there? Scott.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one I want to ask first, but I was interested in that, well, not quite the last slide there, but the second to last one about the summary and whether people would agree with the summary you had there, Laurie, and why or why not. I myself find it hard to accept what was up there, but there may well be, when I say hard to accept, I can't. I think what he had is pretty correct.
It's all right.
And therefore I would see it as being, well, ludicrous is the word that springs to mind, and therefore I think it's a fair summary, but because it doesn't make sense, it's something that I have now objected to.
Yeah, it was something I came across in, I think it was probably an atheist.
It's not expressed in very complimentary terms.
Yeah, I had thought very carefully about putting that slide in, and I figured, well, it's probably going to be rather thought-provoking, so for that reason I'll put it in. So, but as I say, I was debating, and because I felt in some way it was a bit insulting, so I had to balance between insult and thought-provoking. And
Don't worry, as Christians we're used to that.
So my question from that would be those who allowing for the biased tone of it, is amongst the Orthodox Christians here, is there something there they particularly take exception to, or something that's missing from that that should be there?
Well, it says, all right, the belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie, all right, cosmic Jewish zombie is a little...
yeah, well,
all right, can make you live forever. Well, like the...
keep talking.
All religions are aiming to address the problems of evil, suffering and death. So, the problem of the eternal life is a solution to the problem of death. So it's natural that anything that an act of God address the problem of death. So I fully defend that statement that through Jesus we can live forever. So I ascribe to that. Is it ridiculous? I don't think so.
So why is it not ridiculous?
Why is it not ridiculous? That God should act and do something about the problem of death so that we may have eternal life. That to me seems reasonable.
Well, I agree it's a noble aim, but I don't agree with the means that Christianity attests to.
All right, because it says to eat his flesh. To eat his flesh. With that, when it talks about eating his flesh, that's symbolic.
It says symbolic.
Sorry? Right, yeah. Well, symbolically eating his flesh. So that's to trust in the death of Christ, who died as an atonement for sins, so that we might be forgiven and live forever.
And eating is how we get life. You know, if you don't eat, you die. So it's a sort of a symbolic eating. You know, you're being nourished. You're getting your life from not the death of a cow in this case.
I think the issue with your response, Kevin, to your question was that you weren't so much answering the question, or rather your answer begged the question of, well, there is a God and God will make you live forever. Therefore that makes sense, because God who could do that would want to make you live forever, so why are you picking on this? What's wrong?
It is a rather cynical statement, but to be fair, there's also one just as cynical about atheism. So, oh, look, I'm not sure. It was just if you go to Google images and put in atheism and Christianity, all sorts, and you get all sorts of graphics, and that was one of them. So
maybe, well, I hope it's relevant, but what about the problem of suffering or suffering and evil? I cannot, and will not, doesn't matter which one it is really, I cannot and will not accept that an all-powerful, all-loving God could allow evil and suffering to exist in the universe in the way that it does. So
We've had a number of evenings discussing that, and I'm sure it'll come around again.
right. Yeah. Let's put it another way, and I know this might even sound blasphemous, but if I was God and all-loving, all-powerful, the all-loving, all-powerful force in the universe, I would certainly not have anyone going to hell forever. In fact, even someone like Hitler, I would think there'd be a limit as to how much suffering.
I think if we apply Occam's razor and just simplify it and say, well, there's no God, so that simplifies. Yes,
I will add something, some comment to it, because it strikes me that every religion tries to find the justification for people suffering instead of doing something about that suffering.
Actually, that's wrong in terms of Christianity has been a moral force for I mean, it may have been
Where is the condemnation of the slavery?
Hang on.
Who invented hospitals?
Where is the condemnation
No,
of the slavery?
I'm saying
well, perhaps we could get someone to speak on that topic at another meeting. No, don't ask me.
I tell you, just on that, Laurie, I did find very interesting, and I did find agreement with what I think you were saying beneath the lines, when you talked about slavery in the Roman world and how slavery disenfranchised common free people from their working situation. And if you look at us in the Western world, that's where we're at too. You know, we average people in the Western world, we're always trying to come up with jobs for us, primarily because almost everything that we use, own and everything else is made by slaves somewhere else.
Yeah, well,
It's not a topic, but I think we'd agree with that.
yeah, what I was trying to get over was if there was ever a time in history for a new religion like Christianity to appear, that was the ideal time. So make of that what you like.
Yeah. Well, I think that
Yeah.
that's pretty well true as
Yeah.
far as it goes, and I think that Christianity still appeals to average people, as well as everyone. It's for everyone. It's not an elitist religion.
Yeah. Well, the religions of that time, like worship of Dionysus and the Elysian mysteries and all that, they were very elaborate, and you had to be very wealthy to participate. As I said, it was a bit like the Masons, but more so, more elitist, and only the wealthy could afford it. So.
But then I've had experience of, say, Hadrian's Wall, and went to a small chapel there that was obviously to the soldiers. So the religion was part of everyday life of everybody, so even the elite and the poor. The poor weren't denied, or the soldiers weren't denied their religion.
Yeah, I'm not saying they were denied, but it was a different form of religion. It was very much that if you were rich, you got attention from the priests and looked after, whereas the poor, yes, they still worshipped the various gods, but on a lower key, lower level. And a lot of the Roman soldiers actually worshipped Mithra. The worship of Mithra actually infiltrated the Roman Empire at this time, and there was a bit of almost an outright war. People weren't sure whether Christianity would survive or Mithraism would survive, and in the end Christianity triumphed over Mithraism, but it adopted a lot of the traditions, teachings of the Mithra mythos, like the sacrificial blood of the bull, whereas in Christianity it was the lamb. But as I said, that the priests of Mithra were called fathers, and so the Christian priests became fathers, and the laity in the Mithraic were brothers and sisters, and they even had the celibate orders of monks and sisters, which was also adopted by the early Christian church.
The earliest records we have of Mithraism are right at the end of the 1st century, Roman Mithraism postdates Christianity.
Oh, yeah. Yes,
and,
it's...
a lot of the so-called parallels come from stuff that was written half a century after the Gospels were written.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because what happened was that...
So what do you make of that, Laurie?
Well, what happened was the Mithraic religion came out of Persia, and it was based on the worship of Ahura Mazda, who was the god of light. And he was in competition with the god of darkness. I can't think of his name now, but you had this dualism. And Mithra was the son of the god. He was the saviour god that came down to save mankind and was crucified. Sorry?
Persian Mithraism had died out, was dead by the time the
Yeah, well,
came around. And there was virtually no connection between Roman Mithraism and Persian Mithraism.
Yeah. A lot of these religions, you have to understand, they were not static. They kept evolving and developing and borrowing ideas from other groups. What happened was, if somebody saw, oh yeah, this particular thing in the worship of Isis is pretty good, all right, we'll adopt that. So they, for instance, one of the popular traditions of the worship of Isis was to parade through the streets with the sacred phallus carried by castrated followers, because they were so devoted to the worship of Isis they had castrated themselves, and they became the elite, and they were eligible to carry this litter with this sacred phallus. And these street exhibitions, I mean, when you think about the Mardi Gras and all these traditions that, especially within the Catholic Church and in South America and the Mediterranean, where they carry the statue of Mary through the streets, and they go back thousands of years. So.
If I can have a second bite of the cherry. Hopefully this is a relatively straightforward one. Would the Christians present here believe that the Bible is infallible?
Oh, well, we've had some really interesting evenings discussing that one.
Sure. So, right, sure. So, assuming that if one accepts the premise that the Bible is infallible, then you would only need one counterexample to prove that it is fallible. Is that reasonable logic?
Yeah.
And I gather that one of them is the factual error that Caesar Augustus said that the whole world was going to be taxed, and there's no record of that.
If you like to Google the Black Bible, it's it's not an official skeptic site, but it's called the Black Bible, and it examines contradictions in the Bible, and so. Yeah. I mean, what was the name of the giant that David killed? Yeah, but that's only one version. There are 3 different versions, and he has 3 different names. So, and he was killed by 3 different people. So, I mean, anyway, yeah, let's not get into that. That's a subject on its own.
We are a house divided. All right? Okay. I think most Christians would say that the Bible is inspired by God, but whether it means it's infallible, inerrant, or whether it contains is kind of the best shot by guys having a go writing what they believe to be true. You know, Christians hold various views on that.
Anyway, how are we getting on for time?
Badly.
I'm sorry to have kept you so long, because I...
Has anybody else got a burning question?
Yeah, well, any last questions? Yeah. I hate it when the speakers go on too long, and I'm sorry I'm guilty of that too. I went very much over time.
Yeah. Eric?
I was going to say, do you see the New Testament writers other than Paul? Eric.
Oh, sorry?
Do you see the New Testament writers other than Paul as mostly been writing from Paul's version of Christianity, or or some of the New Testament as being sort of the Nazarenes?
No, what had happened by that time, as I said, Mark was, they reckon about 70 AD was the first. By that time they had grown up a number of oral traditions, and they were trying to put them down because they were starting to realise that Jesus was not going to come back as they're supposed to have. And people were asking, well, what do we know about this Jesus? And so they started putting down this oral tradition. But mixed up with it was a lot of the already existing ideas which had evolved about who this Jesus was. By that time he'd morphed from a human being into this divine, transcendental saviour deity. And so you had all this stuff mixed up. So when the Gospels are written, you find that they just accept the fact that Jesus was a divine being. And so the idea that he could perform miracles, well, all the gods perform miracles, so Jesus had to. So it was just a fait accompli. They just assumed that was the way it was. And so it was written by people that had this belief. So it was very much fictional, but they believed it wasn't.
So what made them write it?
Sorry?
So what made them write it?
Well, as I said, by this time, the original disciples didn't consider it was worthwhile putting down anything on paper because they believed Jesus was coming any day. And then the days turn into months and then years.
But why did they write what they... Why did they distort things as you said they did?
Sorry, why did
they distort things as you say they're doing?
Why did they...
What was the motive for distorting? Distorting. Yeah,
Like why they make up the stories, why did they change?
Well, these had become traditional, as I said, that when they were in the tavern having a few drinks and they would be arguing, and there's all this one-upmanship that whatever the pagans said about their gods, the Christians had to retaliate. So Jesus had to be one better. If Poseidon could still the stormy seas, Jesus could still the storms. If the Asclepius could heal the sick and raise the dead, also there were a number of other figures that were supposed to have done it, Apollonius of Tyana, etc., etc. Jesus had to have these powers too. He had to be one better than all these other gods, because while Asclepius was the god of healing, that's all he did. And Poseidon was the god of thunder and lightning and the stormy seas, and each god had his own domain. But what happened was the Christians said, well, if Jesus is the unbegotten deity, then he must be greater than all these pagan gods. So whatever they do, he does better. And so you had all these stories. Jesus healed the sick, he raised the dead. I mean, in the Hellenic world, only Hades had the power to raise the dead. Jesus could do it. So
the fundamental reason why I'm a Christian is not that up there. It's actually that you love your neighbour as you love yourself, and that's the most...
Yeah, but that wasn't one of Jesus' teachings.
Yeah, that convinced me first.
One, the golden rule...
Without that, it's hollow.
Jesus didn't originate that rule. It was...
Without that, I do agree with you.
I'm surprised nobody has queried me on that thing that I said his mother might have been called Mary. Why did I say that? Well, because all the ancient deities were born of virgins, and they were all called Maya, or Mary or Marianne, or a name which translates into Mary. Now, we know that in those days women weren't very important, so this is 50 or so years after when the Gospel began to be written. They might have forgotten what her name was, because she was only a woman. So they would have said, well, if God was born of a virgin, what was his mother's name? Oh, well, it would have to be Mary, because all the other deities were their mother. I mean, Buddha's mother was Maya, Mary. Krishna's mother was Mary.
His mother is at the cross. I very much doubt that they would have forgotten her name.
No, well, we're talking about 50 years.
They knew the names of all of these.
Yeah. Anyway,
There's a lot of things that could be said, but I better wind.
yeah, I think we've.
We better wind up, otherwise the Queen will get very upset. We often give a gift from the Dionysus, a bottle of wine, but we know you don't drink, so Dionysus won't be very good for you. So you quoted from books, and if it's said in a book, it must be right, mustn't it?
Not necessarily, but...
So I am going to give you a book. It's called Investigating Jesus, and it's written by a historian, John Dixon. He has a PhD in history and historical studies of the New Testament. So he writes in peer-reviewed journals. It's in a book, so it must be true.
No.
Anyway, I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. So thank you very much for all the effort that you put in, and it has been a lively discussion. We're not going to resolve it all tonight, are we?
No.
We're not. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope I've inspired a little bit of interest and debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to grab another cup of tea.
Thank you.